Welcome to episode 154 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's April 3rd, 1970. We're in Isa Town, Bahrain, and today's story is about the birth of one of regional football's most durable stages. Because on this day in 1970, Kuwait beat Bahrain 3-1 to win the inaugural Arabian Gulf Cup. At one level, that is simply a first champion. At another, it's the beginning of a football platform that would help give the Gulf states rhythm, rivalry, repetition, and identity. And with hindsight, it looks even bigger than that. Because Kuwait did not just win the first one. Kuwait turned that first title into the opening chapter of Gulf football's first great dynasty. But how did we get here? To understand why this tournament mattered, you have to begin with the late 1960s football map. World football was still not evenly organized, not remotely. Europe and South America still sat at the center of the sport's power. Africa had only just forced change after the 1966 World Cup boycott, and for the 1970 finals had finally secured one guaranteed berth of its own. Asia, meanwhile, was still sharing one place with Oceania. That is the baseline. In 1970, large parts of the non-European, non-South American football world were still fighting not only for trophies, but for structure, access, and recognition. And inside that larger picture, the Gulf was still relatively young as a football region. The game had arrived earlier, of course, through ports, oil company compounds, schools, military contracts, merchants, and workers moving around the Gulf littoral. But national team football infrastructure was still developing. Associations were young. Domestic leagues were still maturing. International calendars were thin. And while Arab football existed as a wider cultural idea, the Gulf states did not yet have a regular tournament of their own that could bring them together again and again. And that is where the pioneers enter. The key vision in the tournament's origin story belongs to Prince Khalid bin Faisal bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. During the 1968 Olympics in Mexico, the idea of a golf tournament was put forward and presented to FIFA president Sir Stanley Rouse. But visions do not stage football by themselves. The Bahrain Football Association was the body that turned the concept into an event. Someone had to do the calls, the invitations, the approvals, the venue work, the scheduling, the ceremonial details, and the practical stitching together that converts a proposal into a tournament. And Bahrain did that work. And the timing mattered. Isa Town Stadium had only been built in 1968, so the first Gulf Cup was not just an idea, it had a stage. A modern enough one, by regional standards, ready almost immediately for the event that would give it a lasting historical importance. The original tournament field was just 4 teams: Bahrain, the hosts, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. That list tells you its own story. No UAE yet, that would come in 1972. No Oman yet, in 74. No Iraq yet, 76. And no Yemen yet, much later. This was Gulf football at its narrowest first shape: small, young, sub-regional, but already competitive. And these 4 teams did not arrive carrying equal football weight. Kuwait were the best positioned. Not yet famous globally, not yet at a World Cup, not yet Asian champions. All of that still lay ahead. But of the 4, they looked the most ready to turn regional football into something serious. Saudi Arabia had footballing ambition and growing sporting structures, but their great continental era was still in the future. Bahrain had the pride and urgency of the host, and Qatar was still at a much earlier stage, though even in this first edition they would produce the tournament's best player. That alone is a lovely early Gulf Cup detail. The team that finished last still produced the competition's standout individual, which tells you that even this first edition was not just about hierarchy, it was about revelation too. The format was simple: a single round robin, no semi-finals, no final, everybody plays everybody, and top of the table wins the cup. Because this was an inaugural event, that simplicity mattered. Less ceremony, more football. A compact tournament that could prove the concept worked. The opening match on March 27 gave the hosts exactly what organizers dream about. Bahrain beat Qatar 2-1. A home win, a crowd invested, and a tournament properly alive from the first afternoon. The next day, Kuwait beat Saudi Arabia 3-1, and that was the first clear signal that the eventual champion might already be stepping forward. Not because the scoreline was overwhelming, but because Kuwait looked like a team with goals in it. Then Bahrain and Saudi Arabia drew 0-0. Kuwait beat Qatar 4-2. Saudi Arabia and Qatar drew 1-1. And by the time we reached April 3rd, the shape of the tournament was clear. Kuwait had won both matches. Bahrain had 1 win and 1 draw. So the last match, Kuwait versus Bahrain, was effectively the tournament decider. That is the nice round-robin tension of an inaugural event. No formal final, but a final all the same. And in that de facto final, Kuwait delivered. They beat Bahrain 3-1. They finished with 3 wins from 3, 10 goals scored, 4 conceded, first Gulf Cup champions. And here's the broader drama of that result. This was not a KG 1-0 champion. This was an opening statement. Kuwait scored 3 against Saudi Arabia, 4 against Qatar, and 3 against Bahrain. When the first Gulf Cup ended, the table did not merely say Kuwait were first. It said Kuwait were the strongest attacking side in the room. Jawad Khalaf and Mohammed Al Masoud finished as joint top scorers with 3 goals each. Saudi goalkeeper Ahmad Eid was named best goalkeeper, and Qatar's Khalid Balan was named best player. And Bahrain, though beaten in the decisive match, at least had the pride of having hosted the tournament successfully and finished runners-up. That last point matters, because inaugural competitions are fragile things that do not become tradition until the 2nd, 3rd, 4th editions actually happen. The first Gulf Cup worked, the football was real, the hosting was real, the rivalry felt natural, and that is why it lasted. So what? Kuwait's win now looks far larger in hindsight than it may have seemed on the day. At the time, it was the first regional title. Important, yes. Prestigious, yes. But still only the start of something unproven. Now we can see more clearly what it was. The launch of Kuwait's long Gulf dominance. Kuwait won the first 4 editions, 70, 72, 74, and 76. They remained the competition's most successful nation with 10 titles. So the inaugural trophy was not some one-off opening flourish. It was the first act of a monopoly. And that monopoly mattered because it fed something larger. As the AFC itself has noted, Kuwait emerged in the late 70s as one of West Asia's rising powers. They reached the AFC Asian Cup final in 76. They won it in 80. Then came Spain 1982, when Kuwait became the first Arab team from Asia to play at a FIFA World Cup. And that is the larger football arc. The Gulf Cup didn't create Kuwaiti football from nothing, but it did give it a recurring regional proving ground, a place where expectations, standards, and identity could harden. Moreover, the tournament mattered beyond Kuwait. Over time, the Gulf Cup expanded from 4 teams to 8. The UAE joined, then Oman, Iraq, and Yemen. And that expansion is part of the point. The competition became a regular meeting place for Gulf football, a sub-regional stage inside the wider Asian and Arab football worlds. That kind of stage matters, even when it's only regional. Maybe especially then. Because football development is not built only through one giant leap to the World Cup. It is built through repetition, federations hosting, players learning tournament football, coaches working under pressure, referees handling rivalry, crowds getting invested, governments noticing that these matches matter, media building narratives, and domestic football gaining reflected prestige from the national side. This is not to say that the Gulf Cup single-handedly made these countries into football nations. That would be too simple. But it absolutely gave them a recurring theater in which football could matter publicly and politically. And once sport matters in that way, resources usually follow. Finally, the competition helped create longer regional arcs. Kuwait were first. Iraq later became their great Gulf rival. Saudi Arabia's great age arrived later still, carrying not just to Gulf titles, but to Asian championships and World Cups. The UAE reached the 1990 World Cup. Saudi Arabia made their World Cup debut in 1994 and then became regular qualifiers. Qatar, who finished last in the first Gulf Cup, eventually used decades of infrastructure building and football investment to become Asian champions in 19 and 23 and host the World Cup in 22. That is one of the most interesting truths in this story. The first tournament didn't reveal the final hierarchy forever. It revealed an early one. And then the Gulf kept changing. The Gulf Cup also shows how football in this region has always lived close to politics. The competition has not unfolded in some sealed sporting laboratory. Wars, diplomatic rifts, security crises, and disputes over hosting have repeatedly shaped it. Iraq were excluded for years after 1990. Editions were delayed, moved, or politically complicated, and yet the tournament survived all of that. In fact, one of the reasons it matters so much is precisely because it sits at that junction: sport, identity, statehood, prestige, regional cooperation, and rivalry. That is why the AGCFF now describes the Gulf Cup not just as a football event, but as a cultural and sporting symbol of Gulf identity. That language is not decorative. It describes what the tournament became. Before we go, 3 things to take away from April 3rd, 1970. First, the inaugural Gulf Cup was born in a football world that was still structurally unequal. That is why creating a regional stage of your own mattered. Second, Kuwait's first title was not just a first title, it was the beginning of Gulf football's first great dynasty. And third, the Gulf Cup's deepest value may be that it gave the region repetition, and repetition is how football cultures grow, through rivalry, through hosting, through memory, and through coming back again. On this day in 1970, Kuwait beat Bahrain 3-1 in Isa Town to win the first Arabian Gulf Cup, the birth of a regional institution and the first clear sign that Kuwait were about to rule Gulf football. That's all for episode 154 of your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a 5-star rating, and share it with all your friends. Tomorrow, we go to April 4, 2009, when Wolfsburg thrashed Bayern 5-1, climbed to the top of the Bundesliga, and stayed there to become the unlikeliest of German champions. See you tomorrow.